Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. It's my first visit to Dublin. I came over yesterday, and I have visited some of the squares we've talked about, so it's been very interesting. I'm a landscape architect by background, and I work for the UK Heritage Lottery Fund, which is one of the 4 good causes, the others being arts, sport and communities, that the money raised by the National Lottery is put towards. I should also say that for 4.5 years I worked for English Heritage, which was the the English government's statutory advisor on the historic environment. I must say I haven't come here to lecture or to talk. Hopefully what I will be able to share is the experiences that we had in London and throughout the UK delivering park projects, and hopefully this might inspire you, and it's an opportunity to really share some of the things that we've learnt. The Heritage Lottery Fund came into existence in 1994 and distributes about 20% of all the good cause money raised by the Heritage Lottery through the National Lottery. We use the money to invest in heritage projects, and just on this slide here are a few of the projects that we invest in. So it's everything from built heritage, cultural heritage, natural heritage, marine, industrial heritage. Whatever people tell us is their heritage, those are the projects with which we'll invest. And to give you an idea of how the money works out, the lottery ticket at the moment is £1 in the UK, and for every £1 that the person pays, 50 pence goes towards the winners, 12 pence goes towards the government in duty, 5 pence to the retailers that sell the tickets, 5 pence to Camelot, who actually organise the thing, 28 pence goes to good causes, which means that the Heritage Lottery Fund, being one of the 4, 6 pence in every £1 goes towards heritage projects. And of all the programmes that we run, one of our most popular and most successful has been the Parks for People programme. 280 projects completed across the UK to date, another 500 currently in delivery. This is Roberts Park in Saltaire, where the project funded the recreation of the bandstand and the opening up of the cafe, which was derelict, which is now run by the Friends Group. And there are some really good examples not too far away from here, across the border in Lisbon, Derry and Antrim. We've got some really good park projects that are now being completed. And we've learned a huge amount from these projects. But first I want to talk to you about the London Squares campaign, which I think is very relevant to what you've been talking about today. Started in 2000 at English Heritage, and the campaign aimed to try and reverse the decline that we were seeing in some of London's squares. And as I think somebody's already said, we reckoned, and this was through going through the A to Z and looking at aerial photos, we reckoned in London there were about 600 garden squares. That's squares, crescents, gardens, all sorts. And they're still being built today. And one of the newest ones is Highbury Square, which is built on the old Arsenal's old football pitch, where the stands are actually apartment blocks. So squares are still being built today. They're entirely relevant today. And the aim of our campaign was to try and use English Heritage's persuasive powers, our statutory powers, our in-house expertise and our fairly limited grant budget to try and make a difference to London squares. One of the greatest problems, it's already been mentioned today, is railings. There are miles of them, well, there should be miles of them. In London, relatively few of the original railings still exist, and where they do, like these, they're cast iron, very expensive to repair. And the problem was that a lot of them were smashed out during the Second World War with the misguided idea that they were useful for the munitions industry. Well, cast iron isn't very useful, and most of it was dumped in the Thames estuary. When the railings were taken out, as Chris said, ours were corked and leaded. Each stanchion went into a stone base. They were just smashed out. So not only we lost the railings, we lost the coping stones as well. And many squares, this has been mentioned, become an absolute haven for clutter. Some still have the old concrete posts and chain link fencing that was put up after the war. Many attract recycling bins, posts, rubbish, all sorts of stuff. A real problem. And in London, there's a real trend for developing cafe culture. In Leicester Square, English Heritage fought off with a whole load of other organisations a campaign to actually pave over the gardens in the middle of Leicester Square to create further covers for cafes. There were already 1,000 covers for people in the square. They wanted to build more. That was resisted, and they've now built an 18 million refurbishment of Leicester Square, which has been primarily funded by Westminster Council and the local businesses there. So cafes can be good, but they can be bad as well. Biodiversity is really critical, and in London we had, working with the London Wildlife Trust, we did a survey of biodiversity across the squares. People forget that they are a crucial link between the private gardens and the major city parks. This is actually in St James's Park, a chap called Sparrowman, it's an RSPB image, making the point that this guy used to go and feed the sparrows every day. You won't find a house sparrow in central London anymore. There are no more. 60% of all species in the UK are in decline. That was a survey that came out earlier this year. We have real problems. Fortunately, I don't think there are too many places like this in London nowadays. Planting beds maintained with herbicides. The guy still edged it conscientiously. There's not much growing in it. Bare soil, the need to just prune shrubs to the ground to allow light, to make places safer, and as someone already said, the massive overgrown plane trees that we were seeing. So you can see there was a need for the Squares campaign. That was back in 2000. Well, since then, English Heritage invested about 2.3 million and actually delivered 13 projects, and is still continuing today to deliver projects when it has the opportunity. And in every case, that English Heritage money was matched by either local authority money or money from trusts, owners, from residents, local businesses, and my own organisation, the Heritage Lottery Fund. And one that I know Leslie's recently been to see, Russell Square, really successful scheme, restored in 2006 with a 1.2 million grant from Heritage Lottery Fund and money from Camden Council. Restored back to a design attributed to Humphrey Repton, and it meant bringing back a fountain into the centre, or creating a fountain in the centre, but also recreating the path network and a lot of the planting that has gone back into there. With a great attention to quality. Quality is really important. Whilst many of these projects you can't afford to put full cast iron railings back, at Russell Square there are 800 metres of railing. It's steel uprights, but with cast iron finials, careful detailing, reconstituted Portland stone plinths, but with the uprights corked into them. So it looks convincing, it looks like a traditional scheme. To mention a few more, one of the other ones we worked on was Fitzroy Square, again in Georgian London. This had a 1970s makeover. Worryingly, it was attributed to a well-known landscape architect called Geoffrey Jellicoe. And before we ripped it out, I'm pleased to say we checked, and his design that he did was never actually implemented. This was Camden's own design. And it was a very vigorous geometric design with bollards that didn't relate to the architecture at all. The solution was to take a lot of that out and to put back the original levels, to focus on the architecture of the buildings and to create simplicity. And I would say that simplicity is the hardest thing to create. Actually getting rid of things, we succeeded here on virtually everything apart from one utilities cabinet that we couldn't get rid of. But trying to create simple is very difficult. And I would urge you, please do try and avoid paving patterns. People panic when they see big areas of empty paving and think, I must put a pattern down, I must put writing on the ground. It distracts people. Plain and simple is what you need. We've also done small projects. This is a very small community garden just around the corner from Paddington Station, run by Westminster Council. Again, this restoration was funded between English Heritage and the Council. Very successful scheme, new railings, new paths, new planting, new features. And probably our most complicated square that we delivered in probably one of London's best Georgian squares was Bedford Square. This was really complicated because the square was blighted by traffic, by parking. The gardens in the middle are actually privately owned, but the public realm was in an appalling state. And again, working with the Camden Council and the Bedford Estate, we invested a huge amount of time and expertise and money in trying to sort this square out. And a lot of it was just trying to make the space simpler, getting rid of clutter. But detailing was so important. We replaced a lot of the York stone paving, and it was aligned on front doors, and then the slabs were dimensioned away from each front door. The pavement became a plinth on which the buildings sit. Bottom left there is a coal hole. There were 62 of these that we managed to recover from around the square, and all of them were reset back into the paving. And we managed to rationalise the parking bays. The key thing in these projects is to avoid importing non-traditional materials. So no Chinese granite here, no Portuguese porphyry stone. It's the traditional materials that make the difference in London. Granite sets tend to be brown, buff or grey from Leicester, from Scotland, wherever. We don't have the kind of the buffy Chinese granites other than in new schemes in London. On now to the work we've been doing with Heritage Lottery Fund. Heritage Lottery Fund's invested 5.5 billion in heritage since 1994. 600 million in public parks, and every project that we now do delivers not just heritage outcomes, that's heritage in better condition, but also people outcomes, that's learning, training, education, volunteering, and also community outcomes, which is improved economic conditions, more and a wider range of people involved in projects. Every single project has to deliver on that. And as a result, we've got a really good portfolio of projects. So if people want to come and see any really good park restoration schemes, I can certainly give you a list all over the UK. In the English Heritage, maintain a register of parks and gardens of special historic interest, and they've just upgraded the public parks section of that list. 30 were upgraded on the register. 80% of those have had restoration works funded through the lottery. You can see the difference that it can really make. And it's not just about restoring historic features. In some projects, we've actually installed new features, but this has always been done using a conservation plan technique. So we make sure that we're keeping the very best, valuing what's there. If there is an opportunity to introduce something new, it's designed sensitively using sensitive materials. It may surprise you to learn that the Lottery Fund has funded over 200 toilet blocks, mainly associated with cafes. Without toilets, parks are useless. People will stay 20 minutes, move on. And people is the real focus of what we do. Again, this is Russell Square. There are thousands of people in Russell Square during the day. I went to Merrion Square yesterday. I saw 2 people who I suspect are probably in the audience because they were showing an unhealthy interest in the detailing of the square. But it was at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, and I was really surprised to see so few people. It was really sad. So cafes are important for animation, water's important, high quality, good quality planting, all those things are so important. And keeping data, knowing how many people are going to these spaces so that you can demonstrate that there are people going, you need to invest that money. A road engineer will tell you how many people drive down a road, what car they're in, what fuel they use, how many times they turn, speed, huge, how many people are travelling in the car, massive amounts of data. We don't do this for parks, well we do now in some in England, but we need to do far more of this. We need to understand how people use these spaces, and then in arguing for revenue budgets we can say, well, we know there were X number of people, we spend this amount of money, you'll find it's peanuts compared to things like leisure centres. And skills are so important too. So gardening, horticulture, most successful projects that we run, we find that we've got a new head gardener working with volunteers. We find that a local councillor is aligned with the project and has been supportive, and that there is an active friends group. And our view is if you have those 3 things, then you'll have a successful park project or a successful horticultural project. And horticulture is a career that is really suffering. It's seen as a very dead-end career. People aren't going into horticulture. But I think that, if you can get a dedicated person who can teach volunteers of the value of being involved with plants and the soil, then it is a wonderful thing to be doing. We've had some really good volunteering projects in many of the squares, and the parts we look at are just too big for a friends group or a user group to take on managing themselves, but they can have a really important role in supporting the park manager, in delivering projects, in delivering fundraising, in running events. And we've got some very good examples of those. I was delighted when Leslie touched on this earlier. This is the connection of squares. We funded quite a few projects in London that helped to reconnect spaces. This zebra crossing was absolutely crucial in trying to get people from Woburn Square to Gordon Square. People couldn't get across the road. 2 new entrances were created. Suddenly it's become a walk-through, and the visitor numbers through those squares have doubled. It's important. The challenge is trying to design it without creating a ton of clutter that goes with it, but it can be done, and it's well worth it. At Heritage Lottery Fund, we've also looked at the architecture, and did you know that, for example, that listed buildings are more likely to be occupied by high-quality independent retailers than chains, which is really important if you're talking about local distinctiveness. And in England, we discovered that listed buildings account for, where they're used for commercial use, will generate a 4.4% higher revenue in a listed building than it will in another commercial building. So they are of great value. Yes, they cost more to maintain, but they are a huge value. The research report there, New Ideas Need Old Buildings, you can download from our website, and I'll show you the web address at the end, but a really useful research tool. and it accompanies a new programme that we've just launched called Heritage Enterprise, which is about trying to address the conservation deficit in trying to get some of these derelict historic buildings back into use by working with local authorities and working with private developers. Cafes, I've mentioned. This is a social enterprise that run by Parks Friends Group that operate a cafe in a park, powered by renewable energy, created and now employs 3 staff. The guy there was a former boxer. The kids don't mess with him because they know he's a former boxer, so there's no vandalism. And they're actually set up a training program now for unemployed teenagers. Brilliant project. And we're promoting that there's a website called Prosperous Parks, which we've just developed, which is all about stimulating income generation in green spaces. And there's some really good examples on there. I've nearly finished. There we go, I'm ahead of time. Good. But finally, I was just going to say it's all about people. And the work that we do is totally about engaging people. Without people, many of these spaces will just become pointless and unused. And if you can engage people actively, then you will find that they'll understand what the space is about, and that will they'll become rewarded from that experience, and the space will be better managed. The crucial thing is that volunteers, and I'm sure there are many of you in here that volunteers don't just keep coming all the time. Volunteers need to be rewarded, and they need to understand that they're achieving things and that success is being recognised. So lots of people say to us in our projects, well, we had a volunteer coordinator, but we can't afford to employ that post anymore, so they're going to go. What you will find is your volunteers will disappear. Having somebody who's there to coordinate, manage and facilitate volunteering and train volunteers is absolutely crucial and is something we support in every project. I could have gone on. There's more squares that we've talked about and we've worked on, but I'll finish there. So thank you very much.